Hey guys, good morning. Real pleasure to have Brad Feld today. Brad is one of those really passionate people about startups and about smaller communities. So he's done that by being a VC and through a couple of books he's written, very influential startup-oriented books. Brad, good to have you. Hopefully you're doing well in Colorado. Why don't you fill in the gaps about yourself and about God knows how many entities you've started in the last couple of decades.
Vinnie, it's delightful to see you again, and thanks for having me. I've been an investor since the mid-90s. I started as an angel investor after I sold my first company, made about 40 angel investments between 1994 and 1996, and then started as a venture capital investor in 1996, 97, originally with a spinoff from SoftBank called SoftBank Technology Ventures, which became Mobius Venture Capital. And subsequently in 2007, with a handful of my colleagues from Mobius, started a new firm called Foundry Group, which has been investing since 2007 all around the US in tech companies. We're based in Boulder, Colorado, but we probably only have about a third of our investments, maybe even 25% of our investments at this point in Colorado, pretty broadly distributed. I co-founded TechStars in 2006 with David Cohen, David Brown, and Jared Polis. Jared and I are not active in running TechStars on a day-to-day basis, although I'm on the board and we're major investors, so involved from that perspective. And TechStars now has about 50 accelerator programs running a year around the world, invests in about 500 companies a year at the pre-seed stage, and also has a number of other programs around ecosystem development and corporate activity linked to the entrepreneurial ecosystem. I have no kids. I have 2 dogs and a wife, and Amy and I spend a lot of time together. And
Brad, I've been interviewing a number of executives about what I call acrobatics and heroics in the last 4 months, right? I've been just so amazed at what people have done. But you walk over, and we could talk about healthcare heroics, auto companies jumping in to make ventilators, distilleries making hand sanitizers, all kinds of last mile logistics, innovations. You've been watching startups, right? Tell us about some heroics and acrobatics you've seen in your portfolios or in all the different groups you run around.
They probably fall into a couple of categories. There's companies that, I don't want to say benefit from the COVID crisis because that sounds opportunistic, but where the COVID crisis is additive to their business. And, the easy examples that people can get their mind around are things like last mile delivery of stuff, right? The idea that you'd ever go into, I've always thought of grocery stores as food warehouses, and you go into the food warehouse and you pick stuff off the shelf and you put it in your cart and then you take it home. Well, I think there's a lot of people who will never go into the food warehouse again, right? That food will either be delivered to them at home or that food will be delivered, put in their trunk. So there's just a lot of stuff that's pretty clear in terms of natural behavior change. Video conferencing would be an example of that, where in January, if you'd said the vast majority of office workers would be working from home via video conferencing, people would have said you're out of your mind. And of course, today, that's exactly what's happening. But in my world, I'd say there's some of those companies. Then there's companies that were inhibited by the crisis. If you have a company that depends on people going to an office or depends on people traveling, you had a really, really, really brutal 2 or 3 months. And I think the heroics of those companies were that they dealt with their reality very early, cost reductions, usually around people, which sucks, but is part of being a startup, is you have to deal with reality. And now they're seeing their businesses come back and be much stronger because of the base that they're building off of going forward versus where they were before. And then you've got a bunch of companies in the middle where it's not necessarily obvious that they're going to be ones that can do something in this moment, but then come up with very, very powerful innovation that has impact on them. And one of my favorite examples is a company called Whoop. They make a strap that tracks about 100 times more data per second than an Apple Watch or a Fitbit. We were early investors in Fitbit, which I also still wear. So sort of understanding of the notion of tracking different things about you. And they were the first company to really understand from their data that the correlation between what's called respiratory rate and COVID infection. And as a result, they, in addition to using the current data, they used all of the historical data, of course, anonymized in terms of the individual users, but to be able to back test this huge amount of data and realize what the curve associated with respiratory rate looks like when you're asymptomatic. And they've got a handful of papers that are in peer review now, sort of talking through how that works. So it'll be, scientifically validated. I think it already is scientifically validated with one of the papers that came out. And they've introduced that into their product. And so suddenly, as a diagnostic tool, to see whether or not you're asymptomatic, in addition to things like temperature testing, which is it's pretty coarse grained, right? The temperature testing is not a great indication. It's an indication, but it's not a great indication. All of a sudden, you can start to monitor the data, and you think about the challenges of things like sports getting back into action. Having that kind of pre-symptomatic or asymptomatic data is key. And the Whoop example, that's a fun one, is I'm not a golf fanatic, but there was one of the PGA golfers has noticed his respiratory rate had gone up, was feeling totally fine, got a COVID check, was asymptomatic. And then the PGA decided everybody that's a golfer should have one of these. And now it's part of the protocol as people are trying to manage COVID. So I think you have this phenomenon where you have some companies that are running hard with a business model that all of a sudden COVID accelerated. Companies at the other end of the spectrum that have a business model that COVID really impacted, and the best ones adjusted quickly. Yep. And then companies in the middle where they stepped back, they continued to run their business, and they thought, well, what can we do in this reconfiguration today that, by the way, we believe will be a long-term reconfiguration that we can be additive to in the context of our products and services?
I think that's a very good way to look at it. You talk about interesting innovations like the work one you're talking about. I interviewed the CEO of Battelle yesterday, and they're R&D firms, so they are into all kinds of biotech and other security and so on. But he said, they can detect a molecule of coronavirus in a room. He says, but what do you do with it? If it's just a molecule, do you want to empty the whole room? So he says, we're still trying to figure out a use case, but he thought maybe an airplane would be a good one. If you can detect that, then maybe you don't board the plane. So this could be, it's amazing the amount of innovation that's coming out of all of this.
I think one of the long views that is helpful, and I just read a book by a woman named Deborah McKenzie, which I think was excellent, called COVID-19. I'm not going to get the subtitle quite right, but it's the pandemic that didn't need to happen and what you should do for the next one, what we can do for the next, to prepare for the next one. And it's a powerful book. She wrote it in the last couple of months. She's a longtime science writer, journalist. And it was not a political book at all. It was not a blaming type book. It was a book that studied the history of pandemics and of epidemics. And we've had many, right? And we've had a couple of close calls in the past. HIV was the one that I encountered because I was in college when HIV and AIDS happened. And it was very scary and very mysterious and very misunderstood. And, even today, 30 years later, there's no vaccine for HIV, right? There's now drug therapies, and it's a disease state that you can manage much better than you could in 1983, 1984, but there's no vaccine, right? So there's this long arc where there's this sort of mental model that, we can solve this by just finding a vaccine. The common cold or the flu, the vaccine has a relatively short half-life for the flu, and for the common cold, there is no vaccine. So this idea that there's a solution that just ends is illogical, and she does a great job walking through SARS, MERS, a number of other very, very scary diseases, some of them coronaviruses, some of them HN viruses, flu-type viruses, and the dynamics of how, as a society, in some cases we've reacted really well, but in others we then have had short attention spans. We haven't stayed with it. And COVID is a great example of that, because this is something that was predictable and something we could have been prepared for as a society, and we weren't.
Yep.
And so now the question is, all right, is this going to keep happening in the future? And the answer is yes, based on a bunch of different factors, and she lays them out pretty clearly. And so how are we as a society going to deal with this? And it sort of links back in a way that I hadn't expected to the startup community way, the book that I just came out with, because the book is all about complex systems and applying the notion of complex systems and complexity theory to startup communities and entrepreneurial ecosystems. And it hadn't, I hadn't planned to have it come out in the midst of this collision of multiple complex systems, right? The healthcare crisis, COVID, is a complex system. And much of the language of complexity is in health, right? Emergent behavior, contagion, phase shifts, delays, positive feedback loops, negative feedback loops. Like, these are all language associated with what's actually happening. Economic crisis is a complex system. The mental health crisis, which ensues from the fact that we're stuck in our houses 24 hours a day and are just fundamentally not prepared and used to this kind of dynamic, is also a complex system. It's not that there's a deterministic end state. There's all these different things that are interacting with each other all along the way that are non-deterministic and non-predictable. And yet, as humans, we want to predict, and we want to say, this is what's happening, and this is what the answer is, and this is what we need to do. The media is a really interesting side effect of this that then plays into the system. So, the media theoretically is observing and analyzing and explaining what's happening. That theoretically. I think anybody that pays attention to contemporary media, I don't pay much, but like today, the dynamics around contemporary media are much more blurry, especially with misinformation, especially with social network promotion of information to different categories, filter bubbles, like long list of things that people have been talking about for the last 3 or 4 years. If you look at that now and you think about human beings, there is no source of truth. They don't start by saying, this is a hypothesis, or this is an observation, or this is what we're worried about in this moment. And this is how the things are linked together. They say, this is the truth. Yeah. This is what's happening. And so then as humans, the stimuli that we get is, this is the truth, this is what's happening, rather than inputs into our own critical thinking. That's always gone on, but it's so amplified in this moment.
Let's go back. Brad, it's so interesting to hear you talk about so many aspects of healthcare. How is that influencing your investment philosophy? Because traditionally, you've been a technology investor, right? Are you looking at public health? Are you looking at biotech? What
expertise in biotech? So we're not doing anything in and around biotech because we just don't have expertise there. Although obviously it's a very important area that all of a sudden is getting enormous amount of focus. Historically, we haven't really been what I think are labeled health tech or health informatics type investors. Every now and then we'll have something that is in that area. When I reflect on things that we could have been investors in that we didn't invest in areas, the two most prominent that today I feel like are really rich with opportunity. One is telemedicine, and it's fairly obvious, right? Telemedicine made 10 years of progress in 4 weeks. Yep. The technology of telemedicine has existed for a long time. It's not new technology, but the incumbent dynamics, which included government and HIPAA in the US, and but also hospital systems, doctors, insurance, really didn't encourage telemedicine, or in a lot of cases didn't allow it to be enabled. And overnight, a lot of that turned upside down.
Yep.
It's a good example of technology that exists that can be applied to a problem, but the will of the incumbents is such that it suppresses technology. We're seeing a lot of those all of a sudden as emergent opportunities, both as businesses and for investments. So that's one area that, today I look at that and say that's a fairly obvious thing that we could have done. We've obviously invested a lot, Whoop, Fitbit, around human instrumentation. And the part of it, though, that we didn't invest in that is another area is actually taking it a step further. And it's a dimension that Whoop is playing on, but actually collecting clinical data versus, just sort of heuristic or human data, and then going deeper with that clinical data in a very broad networked way. So what you're seeing is some systems where doctors are now in a meaningful way with patients collaborating to try to understand the dynamics around disease states. And you saw this, or one saw this with COVID, evolve very rapidly around treatment. Early on in COVID, if you had one of the symptoms that people would show up at the hospital or the emergency room with would be respiratory rates that were extremely elevated and pulse ox, blood oxygen levels that were extremely depressed. So, sort of if your pulse ox is below 80, you're viewed as in distress. And if your pulse ox, I don't know what the number is, 60 or 50, they put you on a ventilator. That's the natural clinical process for that measure. So somebody would show up, 50% pulse ox, they'd stick a ventilator down their throat. And then at some point, we're going to run out of ventilators. We went through that whole cycle with COVID. But doctors started to realize that patients were dying if they gave them a ventilator right away, and that there were a lot of things that could actually improve the blood oxygen level without putting the person on a ventilator. And there's some very simple things. One of them, I don't remember what it's called, but where they roll the person on the side and they do a certain kind of palpitations of the lungs for a period of time. And in a lot of cases, because of the way the disease at the state was working, the pulse ox would go up to 80 or 90, and now you could just do nasal oxygen, or maybe you didn't need oxygen at all. You're still very sick, but you don't need to be on a ventilator. So doctors started to collaborate in ways they couldn't before, versus just in their own hospitals, but across systems and starting to explore. Same thing with different treatment therapies. So I think that layer is quite interesting. The last, which for me is an area that I've cared a lot about because I've been very open about mental health and entrepreneurship and the challenges of stigma associated with mental health, and my belief that we should eliminate the stigma associated with mental health, is different and new approaches to delivering mental health services in a much faster and easily accessible way to a much broader set of people. We just invested in a company recently called Meru Health, MERU Health, and they are basically a marketplace for mental health providers. But the way that they build their marketplace is that they work with insurance companies and companies. And so once they have the relationship with the insurance company that a company insures with, or with an individual company, they can then provide online mental health services via telemedicine, along with a bunch of other content, in a much more accessible way than I need to go find a therapist because I'm feeling some stress. And it's very different than, oh, you should download a meditation app and meditate, right? I mean, real therapy is very different than meditation or mindfulness, which is additive to that cycle. I think that whole category has enormous opportunity to change the way we interact with the healthcare system.
Brad, you mentioned a few things that I've been very excited about. In all the doom and gloom, you look at the US going from 0 to 60 million tests in 3 months, right? I mean, just amazing, the numbers. We could talk about how long it's taking, but just the volume. You talked about how much the hospital system has learned from not overusing ventilators, how they've learned to turn ordinary rooms into ICU capacity in a couple of days, right? How they've learned to parachute people across state lines. Medical professionals have become so mobile. We've learned remdesivir, therapies like that, convalescent plasma, making a huge difference. It's actually amazing what's happened in 3 months, right? And yet, we're not celebrating any of that. It doesn't seem to be. We're focused on the negative. How would you change the narrative on that?
Well, I think it's mixed. And again, I think this is the challenge that we have broadly with in America right now. And I don't think it's something that you can point at a thing and blame it. I don't think you can say it's the media's fault, it's politicians' fault, it's the this fault, it's the that fault. I think we've created, or we're living in a time where the communication dynamics almost by definition have become extraordinarily divisive and very focused on the negative, right? The cliche, if it bleeds, it leads, appears to be the cliche that everybody is operating from. So when you're confronted with optimistic activity, you are extremely optimistic. When you're, then you get into this world of hyperbolic promotion. And that's true, by the way, in entrepreneurship, right? All the time, you look at a company that's taking off, and the promotion, the amazingness of the company often is far ahead of the reality of where the company is and the dynamics of what's happening. And the inverse is true too. On the other end of the spectrum, it's hyperbolic on the negative. when confronted with something like COVID, which is a complex system, March 11th was the day that I really started to be aware of the dynamics around this, around COVID. A group of about 50 tech leaders in Colorado got together on a call. And we literally, the call started with how should we think about our offices? And how should we think about our employees? And how do we think about keeping people safe? Nobody had really yet understood what was going to happen. And certainly we hadn't yet gotten to the place where we had lockdowns broadly across the US, but we're starting to see it in different places. We have a half a dozen companies in Seattle that we're investors in, so we'd already seen that play out. And if you wind forward from March to today, mid-August, or beginning of August, what we've had is an extreme version of this hyperbolic dynamic where at one end of the spectrum, it's getting worse and worse and worse and worse. And at the other end of the spectrum, there's nothing. The dynamics in the communication that people have is such where it's one or the other. There's not rational thought in the middle. Yet there's an enormous number of people who are operating from the context of rational thought. They're just not the ones that are making the hyperbolic statements. And so, you know, the idea, pick a topic, right? Masks, treatments, vaccines, antibody testing, stay at home, economic dynamics. You know, wow, the stock market's doing amazing, yet there's 30 million people unemployed. Like, how do you reconcile any of these things? And so in the context, again, of a complex system, in the moment, trying to be pessimistic or optimistic is actually not that useful. What's useful is to try to understand what's going on and what the interaction between things are. However, as humans, we're naturally emotional. Like, you know, we have whatever the emotions are resulting from whatever the inputs are. If you're at home all the time and you have 3 kids and you're a single mom and you used to have, you know, 2 jobs and now you only have one of those 2 jobs and you're worried about paying rent, and the $600 a month that you were getting from the government was helping, and now all of a sudden you're hearing that it's not going to come anymore. How do you be optimistic in the context of that, right? And so the layers of all these things are very complicated. And in the context of how they interact, I'll use the word complex. They're complex. They're complicated because there's so many different pieces, but they're complex, and the cause and effect of those pieces aren't ones that are obvious in the moment. Now, your question was, why aren't we celebrating the successes? The problem is, I think, for many people, the successes become politicized and the failures become politicized. There's a well understood, and in this book, Deborah talks about it, but I've seen it in a number of other things I've read about pandemics and about health crises. And the message is continually, in a health crisis, leave the politicians out of it. The health crisis should be led by, and the solution to health crisis should be led by the scientists. Interestingly, if you go back to the 1918 flu, and there's a great book called the Pandemic of 1918, or the Influenza of 1918, that sort of goes through the history of the 1918 Spanish flu, which, you know, a lot of people don't realize started in the U.S. And how it got labeled the Spanish flu is an interesting story in and of itself. And in that situation, again, the politicians created way more damage by being the leaders rather than letting the science lead. And ultimately, the science is what played in a leadership position. And there's a lot of dynamics around the long-term impact of that. And it's very interesting when you read this book, you realize that the end of World War I was likely accelerated by the pandemic. More people died from the pandemic than from the war. And then the post-war sort of dividing up of Germany and constraints around Germany, which were not very collaborative, they were very punitive. There's a lot of now political theory that led to the rise of Hitler and the beginnings of World War II. Well, you can't anticipate any of that stuff, right? But you see it again and again and again, which is in a moment of human crisis, we aren't playing a positive sum game where we're trying to help each other as humans. We're playing a zero-sum game where there are winners and losers. And I think that's really part of the challenge of why there's not optimism or celebration of the progress.
Brad, you're talking about a lot of complex interactions and so on. Your book brings out a lot of this collaboration and lack of collaboration between governments and private sector and so on and so forth.
2012, the book that I wrote then was called Startup Communities. And the subtitle was Building an Entrepreneurial Ecosystem in Your City. So if you wanted to create a company, you needed to go to the Bay Area. That was still something people said in the US. And sort of coming out of the financial crisis in 2010, at the same time, there was this broad arc discussion that entrepreneurship and innovation was the path out of the financial crisis. So that's the time period that I wrote this book. And the phrase startup communities didn't exist. And part of my goal was to explain and come up with a thesis for how you could create a startup community in any city in the world. And I've come to believe that every city in the world needs a startup community. And I say to limit it at least 100,000 people. So every city that has at least critical mass of people needs one. Not the only thing in the city, but it needs to be part of the fundamental core and dynamics of that city. And my thesis in that book was around place and being able to build startups and entrepreneurship and startup communities in any place. And the idea of democratizing entrepreneurship around the world. All right, it's 2020, that's happened, right? There's this massive democratization of entrepreneurship. No longer do people say the only place that you can create a significant company is the Bay Area. There's massive evidence that you can build companies all over the world. I live in Boulder, Colorado. It's long been a great example of a smaller city, 100,000 people, where an enormous amount of entrepreneurial activity happens.
Brad, the funny thing is, Steve Case gets a lot of credit for this. Hey, communities around the country should have you deserve probably as much credit, if not more, because you have really made the concept of small community as a hotbed of innovation much more prominent.
Steve and I are intellectual partners in this. He wrote the preface to the first Startup Community book. I just came out with the second edition of Startup Communities. He refreshed the preface. The work that he's done with Rise of the Rest, I've been a huge supporter of. I kind of put this in the category of the outcome is much more interesting to me than who created the outcome. And I think Steve would say the same thing. I think he's been on a mission in the US to spread entrepreneurship broadly. I think he's done an incredible job both doing and advocating for that. And I've tried to do the same. And I have immense respect for what he's done there. When you shift to the new book, The Startup Community Way, in 2017, my co-author Ian Hathaway and I started working on it. We'd done a few things together and gotten to know each other. And Ian is a good co-author to me because I'm very much a practitioner. I'm not a researcher. And Ian came from a perspective of being an economist and a researcher. And he had entrepreneurial experience, but he had that more formalized perspective that he was willing to do that work, whereas I was very anecdotal and very example driven. So we combined those two things. The first year we wrote most of the book. We wrote 30 or 40,000 words, and we didn't like it. We thought it sucked. We were really struggling with what is this book, and we're trying to answer the question. All right, startup communities have been around for 5 or 6 years. What now? So we're trying to write the sequel to the book. In 2018, he landed on the idea that startup communities were complex adaptive systems. And we shortened it to complex systems just to be easier to talk about, less ponderous. And in that, I knew a fair amount about complexity theory. I'd always been fascinated by the Santa Fe Institute and the idea of complexity. And so it landed with me very clearly. And I understood systems thinking. I went to MIT and all of the Jay Forrester systems dynamics stuff that emerged in the 50s and 60s. When I was at school, that was still front and center in how people talked about how systems worked. And we ended up spending the next, or the last year and a half or so going very, very deep on both complexity theory and then applying it to startup communities and entrepreneurial ecosystems, which are distinct things. And it's really useful to define them for people. The goal of the startup community, there's one, which is to help entrepreneurs succeed. So the startup community is this thing where everyone's trying to help entrepreneurs succeed. And then the entrepreneurial ecosystem is the thing around that, which has a lot of different actors in it: government, university, nonprofits, large companies. And at its core, its goal is to help entrepreneurs succeed. But those actors generally have other motivations as well. And those are good. So sort of the linkage of how those things fit together and then how that works, still in a pretty place-based model. So still with focus on, Boulder or Tampa or Abu Dhabi, pick your place.
Yep.
Interestingly, near the end of our process with that book, we started to talk more about startup communities and communities in general and complex systems that didn't have as much dependency on place. And so the idea that the same principles apply, but in a more distributed way. And so we've got a few things in the book about it. I would say that it was...
So Brad, if you were to start writing the book now, would it be very different?
I don't think the book would be that different. I think we'd probably have a chapter or two that wasn't as linked to place, because I think all of the concepts around place apply if instead of place, you put a domain in that. So you focus on a domain, but you instead of it be geography, it's something else. And we're already seeing that, and we already know that because of the broad-based activity around online interactions with each other. And I expect that I don't think the book would be that different, and I think the book applies. My guess is Ian and I will do some intellectual work linking the book to that. I doubt it'll be another book, right? But some content, because the same constructs are the ones that matter. And I'll sort of anchor on one in particular. When people think about a complex system of any sort, or they think about startup community, they tend to focus on the things and the number of things, the number of people, the number of companies, the amount of financing that's raised, the number of exits, stuff like that. By the way, when we talk about COVID and the health crisis, we also tend to focus on the number of things. The number of tests, the number of deaths, the number of hospitalization. The key in a complex system is the parts are important, but they're not the thing that really matters. What really matters is the interaction between the parts. And that's where the magic happens in a complex system. And that's where all of the dynamics happen. So, earlier we're talking about the doctors figuring out a bunch of different things in the context of the treatment. And what they were really focusing on was the interactions. They were saying, when I stick a ventilator down somebody's throat, 70% of the time I'm giving them a death sentence. I don't like that. I don't think that's the right thing. So what's the actual thing that's going on here? What are the interactions? And start to say, the problem is this, and that generates this. And then you start realizing, okay, here are the things that get accelerated. Oh, the thing that's causing this is the cytokine storm. Okay, how do I deal with that? So it's the interactions that then generate the insight, not the absolute number of parts in any of the system. Now, if you take geography out of it, same thing applies.
Yeah.
I just apply a domain instead of a geography.
Yeah. Brad, let's go back to your financial hat. How do you see, as you talk to other VCs, as you talk to your startups, as you see how their business is evolving, what do you think the economy is going to do?
No idea. Absolutely no idea.
Brad, as a VC, you're too modest. You're not allowed to say that.
No, I really don't. I am not a predictor. I also try not to be a prognosticator. I think I fall into the trap that a lot of people do where you prognosticate, I think this is going to happen in the future. I try not to do too much of that. I try to present that all as hypotheses that are then testable hypotheses where I'm constantly, okay, I think this could happen. Why would that happen? And then, over time. But predictions are not a thing that I'm interested in. And here's why. If I make a prediction about the future in a complex system, if I'm right, it's completely an act of randomness because there's so many things that can happen between here and that point of prediction. And that doesn't mean that I don't use the future to try to anticipate what I should do or use it to modify behaviors around certain things. It's not that I'm blind to what's happening and what's going on, but I think the best entrepreneurs and frankly, the best investors have a very good view on scenario analysis.
Yep.
So, I have a view of what to do in any of those letters of a recovery. Do I have an absolute, like, here's the playbook in that letter, and here's the playbook in that letter, and here's the playbook in that? Of course not. And by the way, I'll just give an economic example. We have this incredible dislocation right now between stock prices in the public market in the US and the underlying health of the economy in the US from traditional measures like GDP growth and unemployment. And of course, the stock market, the cliche is that the stock market is anticipating the future, which, might be right or might be wrong. If it was anticipating the future, the stock market would always be correct, right? And in the first, I don't remember the dates, but in the second half of March, right, when the stock market went down, 30% or whatever it went, the major indexes went down by a huge amount. And, you saw a lot of companies that are trading at all-time highs right now, had lost half their value or more in the tech sector. No one could have anticipated, you could have, but nobody could have anticipated it with absolute certainty that the federal government would have put $2 trillion into the system, increased the US debt by 10%, like that. Who knows what the actual dynamics of the Fed have done, right? There was a 24-hour period that is reasonably well known now where the credit markets had frozen. And pretty much every large cap company drew down all of its available debt because they were afraid that they couldn't turn over their commercial paper, and they were anticipating credit markets freezing again, which the Fed, did something very specific that unfroze that. Like those things you can't anticipate in the moment. You can kind of say, well, if they do this, and this, that'll happen. Now, take it down the next level. We're talking at the macro level. If I'm that single mother of three kids with 2 jobs, fuck if that helps me, right? And so you have this interesting disconnect between all these things. I don't know that restaurants as an industry will ever be the same. I don't want to go to a restaurant. A lot of people do. A lot of restaurants hope that they'll be the same, but who knows? Here's another one that is not sort of built in and wired into the thinking yet. Everybody thinks that we're going to go back to school, and everybody thinks that we're going to go back to our office buildings at some point. What if we don't? What if we change the way that works? What if that system is not functional going forward? And what happens if we end up with 25% or 50% excess commercial office space in the United States in 2021 and 2022? I mean, it's a hypothesis. Like, what would you do against the backdrop of that hypothesis? But as a prediction, I don't know. And how's that going to impact, quote, the recovery? So I think it's a dangerous trap to predict.
Well, Brad, you're awfully humble to say that. Any final thoughts?
Vinnie, this was fun. I like this. I like the questions and the stimuli of this. Look, I'm personally long-term optimistic as a human. I also know that as humans we die, and so the experience that's interesting is the moment, is the now, and that's another lesson from complexity theory: is that understanding the moment and being in the moment and engaging in the moment with things that you think can have impacts on what you want. And then applying, again, the interaction between the parts, not the parts,
right,
is what's so powerful. And I just encourage everybody that's listening, whether they're in business or in entrepreneurs or anything else, to really focus on the interaction effects and how what you're doing today is cumulatively impacting different things. And I'd leave it with a phrase. I think it's from, I'm not a football fan, but I think it's from that football movie with Coach Taylor in it, Friday Night Lights. And I kind of want to say it's soft hand, strong heart sticks with me.
Brad, that's a great way to end it. Thank you so much.